welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et re-bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and it's time for another monthly reading wrap-up. April was an all-over-the-place month, personal life and mental health-wise. And it was an interesting month, reading-wise, I think. It was a very mixed month overall. I did manage to read, though, 9 books? Which isn't what was planned at the beginning of the month, but then something happened and I had to shuffle books around on my TBR, and so yeah, I ended up reading 9 books. As I've done in my most recent reading wrap-ups, I'll be going through the books I read in simple chronological order. So first, I'll mention The Bitter Twins and The Poison Song by Jen Williams. These are the second and third books in the Winning Flame trilogy, which I adored. I made a rave review for the entire trilogy if you want to check that out. I try to keep it mostly spoiler-free and do have a more spoilerish section towards the end of it. I love this series. Obviously, I can't really go into any kind of detail as to what happens in these books, because that would be spoiling them, and I already talked sufficiently about the Ninth Reign, which you should definitely pick up to see if you want to pursue with the series, but I would obviously highly recommend you do so. Books 2 and 3 were just as good, if not better, than the first book, The Ninth Reign. I felt all the feels in these novels. I tore through them. It's been a while since I read a fantasy trilogy that was this good, since I read a fantasy trilogy this rapidly. I think the last time I read through a trilogy, an SFF trilogy of books that quickly, was The Southern Reach, and that was back in 2017, I think. So yeah, that should give you an idea of how good this was and how long it'd been since I'd read something this good. And then I don't even have it with me anymore because I've already unhauled the bitch. I read Semiosis by Burke and I hated it. It was absolute trash. I made my very first rot review of the year about it. A rot review following a rave review. That was a trip in and of itself. So yeah, Semiosis is basically about Earth colonizers going to an alien planet called Pax, and that planet hosts very intelligent plant-like life forms. And that's the nice way of putting it. I mean, that's the premise. It's the promise made by the synopsis and the title, but it most certainly does not deliver on said promise. You can hear me rage about that in said rot review. I was supposed to read Interference after I'd read Semiosis and then do a dual review for both these books. That wasn't going to happen. I didn't even read Interference. I did push myself to finish Semiosis, and my reward for that was not having to read Interference, so I unhauled both of them. In fact, I sold them. I made some money off of them, so that was a good thing. But yeah, hated that book. Kind of like with the Winning Flame trilogy, it'd been a long while since I'd read something that bad. My last rant review dated back to December of 2020 with God Emperor of Dune. But God Emperor of Dune, guess what, was actually better than Semiosis by Burke, so that should tell you the level of bad I thought it rested at. And now, what was interesting about April is that it was a memoir month for me, both in prose and graphic format. So first, I reread Le Consentement by Vanessa Springora. This has this year been translated into English as, quite simply, Consent, a direct translation. Now, I read this as I was rage reading through Semiosis, and I reread this memoir because I had planned to read the memoir being Lolita, which I will get to in a minute. And I did a dual review for both of these memoirs since they both have to do with surviving a sexually abusive relationship, including a grooming component, though in fairly distinctive and different ways. It was a dual review, but in 2 parts. So basically, I admit each video is basically a book review, but since they are thematically linked and I had planned to read them back to back, both of those videos together make a dual review. So in any case, part 1 of this dual review in 2 video parts has to do with Le Consentement, where I share my opinions about the memoir, where I give a bit of, more than a bit of personal context as to why I read these types of stories and an update on said personal context. I really get into it. It's personal, it's messy, but hopefully it's interesting. So if you want to, you could check those videos out. So like I said, they're memoirs that concern themselves with surviving sexually abusive relationships. In the case of Consent, it is what I decided to term in my reviews a pedo-hemophilic grooming narrative or a Lolita responsive narrative. So this tells of the author's relationship with a French author named Gabriel Matzneff. You can check it out on Google. There's been several newspaper articles about l'affaire Matzneff in English and in French, so if you want more info on that, and of course, check out the memoir if you're interested. So it tells of her abusive relationship. She was 13, 14, was groomed into a sexual relationship with author Gabriel Matzneff, who was 50 years old, and author Gabriel Matzneff was, at some point, like in the 70s and the early 80s, fairly renowned in France, though not internationally speaking. And the guy is a pedophilia apologist and did the apology of pedophilia in a lot of his writings. He is now on trial for, the apology of pedophilia in media. He's also under investigation for sexual abuse of minors, though not for Miss Springora, unfortunately, because the statute of limitations has run out for her. So, she took the matter into her own hands and wrote this memoir. And it's very well written, at least in French. Cannot speak to the quality of the translation. It's very well written. I really enjoyed the author's tone, which is very dignified, poised, and mature, I think is how I put it. And it's interesting because you get to see what goes on in the mind of a victim in that situation, but you also get a glimpse of Matzneff's psychology, which is really, I think, applicable to just predators of his type in general. It's definitely applicable to my own abuser. And the author also does give a bit of context on the socio-historical context of these years that were the 60s and 70s, post-May 68, post-sexual liberation / revolution, the excesses that came out of these ideals, which weren't bad in and of themselves, but it led to some excesses and just tolerating questionable things such as sexual liberation of minors, pedophilia, and things like that. All in all, it's a good memoir. I would definitely recommend it. I gave it a solid 7 out of 10. I had, in fact, bumped it up from a previous 6 to 6.5 out of 10 back in 2020 when I first read it. And so directly after that, I did read Being Lolita by Alisson Wood. Again, has to do with surviving a sexually abusive grooming type relationship. However, it is not of the, as I call it, Lolita responsive type or pedo-hemophilic grooming type, as is in fact implied by the title, but the title, I maintain, is massively false advertising, though probably not the fault of the author herself. I had massive issues with this memoir. I went into it at length in part 2 of that 2-part dual review I just mentioned, if you want to check it out. I also give additional personal context information in said video. So I go in depth as to what bugged me with this memoir, but if I had to summarize it, basically, I thought the author appropriated a type of experience she didn't in fact live through. She was in an abusive relationship. Yes, she was raped. Sadly, yes. She was even groomed into said relationship, but it was adult on adult, albeit younger adult grooming. It wasn't adult on child, very young teenager grooming, and I do think that's an important distinction and difference. Add to that she draws a lot of parallels between her own story and that of Lolita, when in fact, what happens in the novel Lolita to Dolores Hayes is very different from what she lived through, and is even quite different from all these Lolita responsive narratives I talk about in my reviews, such as My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell, or Putney by Sofka Zinoviev, or even the real-life story of Ms. Vanessa Springora in Consent. And that just rubbed me the wrong way. I don't know why this author chose to do this. Maybe I just don't know. But to me, she appropriated an experience she simply didn't have, which is puzzling and distressing and quite sad because her experience of abuse is perfectly legitimate as it was. But as such, I found it quite honestly offensive. So massive fail for me. I gave it a 3 out of 10. And again, you want more info? You're more than welcome to check out the related videos. So that week I read Being Lolita. I was supposed to read, that's how I had planned it out on my monthly TBR. I was supposed to read Interference by Sue Burke, but alas, that was not to happen. But I did say it was a memoir month because I read 2 additional memoirs, one in graphic novel format and one in prose format. I'll start with the former. So I read Tout va bien by Charlie Genmoor. This is in French, as the title might have clued you in. So a French graphic memoir about the author's coming-of-age experience. I say it that way because I was actually a bit puzzled as to the direction the author wanted to take this in. It talks about the author's difficulties with depression, with family life, with relationships, especially sexual relationships. But I thought it lacked a directed narrative thread, if that makes sense. It was just a bit wishy-washy, just bits and pieces of experience without anything to really hold them together into one cohesive whole. So that was disappointing. There's the beginnings of a reflection about amatonormativity, about that's my personal belief, the false dichotomy between friendship love and romantic love. But then it never actually goes anywhere. The author does, in fact, end up in a pretty traditional or traditionally defined romantic relationship without further questioning of said categories. So that was a bit of a flop for me. Sure, the discussions about gender identity, sexuality, a lot of it was a bit too SJW-y for me. I know what I mean, so I'll leave it at that. Though there were bits that were, positive in the sense that they discussed issues with feminine anatomy, issues with female sexuality, that were just discussed without any judgment, that were, destigmatized, and I thought that was nice. There isn't ever any real context given to the author's supposed struggles with mental health and mental illness. It's said they were depressed. You never really know what, how long they took medication, and it never really goes anywhere, so I just couldn't really connect and didn't really understand what was going on in the author's mind, I guess. I did enjoy the art style. It's monochrome, just shades of blue throughout. Sometimes the pen strokes were a bit different to reflect different states of mind of the author. So yeah, I liked the aesthetics of it. The art style was neat. But again, the story was just a bit meh, couldn't really connect, couldn't really understand what the direction was supposed to be. It's just a piece of the author's life without any grander narrative to it, which, again, it's a memoir, so that's fine if that's what the author wanted to do, but it left me just feeling a bit blah. 2 books which weren't that good. One, a massive flop. The other just left me feeling massively meh. However, Consent was good. That was a 7 out of 10, so that was a good memoir. Then I read a really good memoir, a really good book, Darkness Visible by William Styron, who I learned was actually a pretty well-known and celebrated American author. Never read any of his novels. He passed away in 2006, so no longer alive. But he experienced at the age of 60, if I remember correctly, a pretty severe episode of acute depression. And so this memoir is about the experience of depression. I really, really enjoyed this memoir. It wasn't flawless. I obviously had my issues because I'm a picky, bitchy reader. Especially when it comes to subjects that, touch me directly. But I can already tell you this was a 7.5 to an 8 out of 10 for me. This was very good. It's very short. As you can see, it's about 85 pages, and it just really tells of the author's episode of depression. The onset of it, the thick of it, basically, and then the resolution of that episode after the author stayed at a psychiatric clinic. What I enjoyed about this, enjoyed is so not the right word for this, but it really spoke to me because this author managed to put into words exactly what I usually experience when I'm going through flare-ups of my chronic, not acute, chronic major depression. It was beautifully written. That obviously massively helped that he had a great pen and so could just find the right words to describe his experience, which is an experience a lot of people with depression will recognize and feel familiar with, unfortunately. He just had a brilliant way of explaining what goes on in the mind when you're deeply depressed. He goes so far as to say that depression isn't a good enough word to really describe what it is. He says in his memoir, a better word for it would be brainstorm. Unfortunately, brainstorm is used to mean something else. But that is so poignantly accurate, because that's exactly how I feel when I'm in the midst of depression. Some people experience depression as a basically massive flattening out of emotions, and I do get that as well. But the beautiful imagery of a storm, even a cyclone, I would say, is you have these swirling winds, and then you have a hole in the middle where everything is calm. I would say the point at which you feel flat and wrung out of any and all emotions, that's the eye of the storm. But then you also have the phases where you're in the freaking storm, in the whirlwind of mental anguish and pain and despair and just emotions being so violent and overwhelming that you don't know what to do with yourself. His depression was so severe that it bordered towards psychosis. I don't think he actually had psychotic depression, but that's something I've also experienced. I've never actually experienced psychosis proper, but I've kind of seen like the borderlands of psychosis, if that makes sense. It's fucking terrifying. It is not a good place to find yourself in, and he freaking nailed it. Absolutely 1000% nailed those sensations. There's also a beautiful passage about, beautiful. It's heart-shattering, really, but spoke to me. But the fact that it's not so much, well, some people do generally hate themselves, and that's very sad, but for my case, it's not so much that you hate yourself when you're in the thick of it, but it's that you lose every single shred of self-esteem you might have had beforehand. It's not an acquiring of self-hatred, it's just a depletion, a complete and total depletion of self-esteem. It looks very similar to self-loathing and self-hatred, but it's not quite the same thing. That once again spoke to me because that is exactly what I experienced in those moments. Then I did enjoy the fact that the author decided to research depression. Keep in mind, this was written in 1989, so it's slightly dated, though not that much, about the subject of depression and the state of medical knowledge we're at regarding depression and various other mental illnesses. He clearly took the time to research the subject, and so he kind of drops several facts he's learned about depression, how it's very difficult to treat for a lot of people, how, well, science doesn't really actually quite understand how depression functions, and this is most definitely applicable to other mental illnesses as well, and how, medications can help some people, but in the case of like major depressive disorder and severe depression, a lot of times they don't really work, or they don't work well enough, which is better than nothing for those for whom it works, but it's still, we should expect better from our healthcare, basically. I also kind of smiled at his report of his experience on a psychiatric ward. I'm happy to confirm that things have changed. Not everywhere, not for every socioeconomic class, sadly. I do acknowledge that, but I went to a psychiatric clinic for 3 months, and it was perfectly nice. It's perfectly nice. People have these weird thoughts and images about, loony bins. But, the 21st century has happened in that domain as well, thankfully. So there were things I recognized, like he talks about occupational therapy and how some occupational therapists will baby you and, infantilize you. And that is something that can definitely happen on a psychiatric ward. But, you're also kind of responsible for not falling into that. It's also understandable if you do, because you're at a very vulnerable time of your life. So I'm not judging people who do let themselves be babied a bit, but you don't necessarily have to play along with that. So, and it just made me smile. So ultimately, in his case, he does acknowledge that he probably had genetic predispositions and psychological predispositions to depression and flirted with depression throughout his life. But he basically had one severe episode of acute depression at the age of 60, and it kind of resolved itself. He's a very lucky man in that respect, as far as I'm concerned. And he does acknowledge that depression is unique to every individual who experiences it. Obviously you have common traits, otherwise it wouldn't be a disorder, right? A recognized disorder. But he does acknowledge the idiosyncratic nature of the illness. Now, where I couldn't quite follow the author, sadly, I guess you be the judge of that, is his optimism towards the end of the memoir, where he says, the one good thing about depression is that you can come out of it, it can be overcome, etc., etc. I am a much less optimistic person than Mr. Styron was. But again, he had acute depression. I've had chronic depression since I was about 10, 11 years old. So just a difference of life experience of there and experience with the illness. Well, I'm also in the midst, I might not look like it, but just trust me on this, in the midst of a depressive episode with lots of anxiety and somewhat PTSD. I'll leave it at that for now. So I'm just not quite capable of seeing the optimism, feeling the optimism there. But fair enough. Encouraging for others, most probably. So it's not really a flaw. It's just something I couldn't quite relate to because of my personal life circumstances. And then at the very end of the month of April, I squeezed in 2 additional books, which, once again, weren't actually planned on my April TBR, but since I had to shuffle things around, I was like, all right, I'll just shove those on. So I read Baiser, Après, #MeToo by Ovidie, that's the author, and illustrated by the artist Diglee. Ovidie is a French feminist who used to be a porn actress, and she's now written and published a couple of these illustrated books. I have another one of hers called Libre, which is a feminist book talking about fighting, stereotypes and dogmas about beauty and having to shave and things like that, or how to behave in the bedroom, etc. Here, the author decided to tackle the topic of rape culture and consent in relationship to the outcomes, the ongoing developing outcomes of #MeToo, or in French, #Balance ton port. She decides to explore those concepts in the format of writing letters to former lovers who have displayed bad behaviors or who've had bad takes, following #MeToo. She does specify that this is auto-fictional, so not everything she says is something she necessarily experienced, but it's at least something women around her have experienced, friends have told her about. She's bisexual, so she also, in her introduction, says, why not address letters to my former female lovers? She says, because there is no systemic problem in that regard with other women. It just is not applicable to homosexual female relationships. Not saying that there can't be abusive behavior in homosexual female relationships, and that's not what she says either, but it's not a systemic problem as it is with heterosexual relationships. Nothing in there was new to me. Nothing was truly revolutionary. However, I really highly enjoyed this book because it brought together a lot of these concepts in one single illustrated discussion, basically. I really enjoyed the pseudo-epistolary format. She really tackled a lot of these concepts that have to do with consent, with treating your partner with respect, with perhaps not having such a phallocentric view of sexuality, of, reproductive burden, emotional labor, a lot of just feminist 101 concepts and concepts related to what is called rape culture. I enjoyed her tone. It's both familiar and formal, good language, and also more vulgar language. But what really kind of elevates this is honestly the illustrations. I really enjoy the style of this illustrator, Diglee, and it's things like that. That's the style. There's like one main illustration per chapter or per letter, and they're so on point. Every single one of them. They're quite funny as well, but just funny in a way that makes you think, and you're like, yeah, I recognize that bullshit. So yeah, each illustration is delicious and on point and perfect. They're also like these little cutouts which present complementary information or relevant statistics in relation to what she's talking about in her letter. So yeah, a very good illustrated book on the subject. I would recommend if you read French, obviously. And I would recommend the previous one I read by her as well. Both of them, sit around at an 8, a solid 8 out of 10. And finally, so I had put this on my yearly TBR. I was going to read this towards October, November, but since I had basically a week where I hadn't really planned to read anything and, shuffle things around a bit, I decided to reread, but earlier, The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. So this is a short story collection by famed author Angela Carter. I had read this, I don't quite remember when, to be honest. 5 years ago? 6 years ago? More? A bit less? I can't actually remember when I first read this, but it was in my library. It survived my pretty severe book unhaul. But I was like, I remember the major outlines of the stories, but I don't really remember that well, so it deserves a reread. So that's what I did. I reread it, and I enjoyed this. I'm not exactly sure how I would have rated it X years ago. I have the sense that I enjoyed it a bit more than when I first read it, but it's highly speculative on my part, to be fair. This time around, in any case, I gave this a 7.5 out of 10. So it's a short story collection of reimagined fairy tales. Fairy tales such as Bluebeard, Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White, Puss in Boots. There's also like reimagined vampire stories, so not specifically a fairy tale, but just that general area of like fantastical things and folkloric things. It's reworked with a dose of loosely defined feminist understanding, with a good dose of female centricity, I guess I'll just put it that way, with a good dose of eroticism too. I was actually quite surprised at how erotic some of the stories are in there. Like The Bloody Chamber, which is a Bluebeard retelling more or less, is quite erotic. And most of these stories are very sensual. But that's also because of the way she writes. I was impressed by the writing style, did not remember it being that lush, that luxuriant. Sometimes it's even a bit too much for my taste, which might surprise some people who, heard me wax enthusiastic about H.P. Lovecraft's writing, where the purple prosiness of it really doesn't bug me. And it didn't bug me here, that's not the right word, but sometimes I was like, maybe this is just tad bit too rich even for my taste, but it also means it was richly layered with meaning and symbolism, all these elements of folklore. Like you have the obvious ones, which clearly are the main inspirations for the stories, but there are just other elements of more folklore and the fairy tale tradition that go into there, and the female-centric imagery and the bodily imagery, and that's what also makes it very sensual. It's the writing itself is very sensual, really. Obviously, I enjoyed some of the stories more than others, as is always the case with short fiction. Most of these stories are like 20 pages long. There's one, Snow White, which is like 2 pages long, and I cannot connect with fiction that is that short. I can't. It has to be poetry in that case for it to work for me. I don't know. And the longer one, like The Bloody Chamber, is kind of a novelette, so that's around 40 pages long. And the one thing that kind of bothered me, or at least, dampened my enthusiasm for this collection a bit, was that oftentimes I thought that Angela Carter could have basically dropped the very last sentence from a few of these stories. The writing was beautiful and you're really into the story, just soaked, drenched in this symbolism, in this sensuality. And then the story ends, and it could just end there, and then she adds a sentence that kind of broke it for me. It felt like rocks hitting the pavement. It was like, no, you didn't need to write that in. That it felt like false notes. So that was a bit disappointing. But otherwise, yeah, a good collection. I have, in fact, read something else by Angela Carter. I read The Passion of New Eve 4 years ago. That was just so freaking weird, though. I don't know if I want to check anything else out by Angela Carter. I need to do some research first. But I'm happy I reread this, and I feel confident in having kept it in my library. So those were all the books I read in the month of April. In May, I will be reading A Natural History of Dragons by Mary Brennan. I will be reading The Girl with All the Gifts by Emma Carey. And I will be reading at least the first 2 books in the Hyperion Canto, so Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons, and then 2 non-fiction books, which you shall discover a month henceforth in my May reading wrap-up. In the meantime, I hope you will have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. I hope your month of April went a bit more smoothly than mine. I hope you all take good care of yourselves. Always happy to chat in the comments, just a friendly reminder. Oh, and I do want to actually add this in. I finally did, in fact, check out my local library and got a library card. Now, don't get me wrong, the selection in English could be better, and I'll still need to rely on our friendly neighborhood evil overlord, Amazon/the Book Depository, to get a lot of my books in English. However, their comic book, graphic fiction selection is very satisfying, since I do read a lot of those kinds of books in French, so that'll save me a lot of money and resorting to our friendly neighborhood evil overlord, that is Amazon/the Book Depository. So yes, I am now the proud owner of a library card. So on that note, I shall see you in the next video. Bye bye!